and see yourself. You stand tall against terrifying enemies. You build masterpieces and break down barriers. You rush into the future and meet your past. Every time, at every moment, the official network of every millennium. The History Channel, where the past comes alive.
They were the glidermen of World War, specially trained pilots and wore in canvas-covered engineless aircraft. Their gliders took them on a one-way trip, deep behind enemy lines, into the most climactic battles of the war. Notoriously dangerous and unreliable, the gliders made easy targets. Getting there was half the battle for the Silent Wing warriors. Next on Suicide Mission. They were the first stealth fighters, able to drop behind enemy lines without a sound and land a fighting force right in the lap of an unsuspecting enemy. American glider pilots and glider infantrymen were at the vanguard of almost every major Allied engagement of the Second World War. The invasion of Sicily, the liberation of France and Holland, the Battle of the Bulge, and the crossing of the Rhine River into Germany. Even in the Pacific War, glidermen conducted daring operations deep inside Japanese-held jungle. The men who flew the gliders were Army Air Force pilots, part of the Troop Carrier Command. The men who rode in the back were specially trained soldiers, typically part of an airborne division. From takeoff to touchdown, every mission for the Silent Wing warrior was fraught with danger, and all too often, a flight ended in disaster.
They wrote that glider off when you took off, and they also wrote the pilots off. But fortunately, we fooled a lot of them when we came back.
You just thought you were immortal. You were only 22, 23 years old. You were invincible. You were going to live forever. The other guy was going to get killed, but you weren't going to get killed.
We were all scared, but not one time do I know of any of my friends or myself were scared enough that we didn't know just exactly what we were going to do when we cut off of that tow rope and where we were going.
You're wondering why you were doing what you did, but this was a job that we had to do, and we did it. Some were lucky, some were unlucky.
Back in the early 1900s, aviation pioneers discovered the fundamentals of flying using gliders. However, with the advent of powered flight, gliders had limited use. In the 1920s and 30s, sportsmen kept alive the thrill of flying in engineless aircraft. The idea of flying a glider into combat was the brainchild of Adolf Hitler. By early 1940, Hitler's blitzkrieg had overrun Poland, and he turned his ambitions to the conquest of France. The most direct path for his panzer divisions was through neighboring Belgium, but in their way stood a fortress named Eben-Emael. The vast underground network of bunkers and gun emplacements was considered impregnable. The German High Command even estimated that it would take 600 crack troops a month to seize Eben-Emael. But Hitler had a surprise up his sleeve. He ordered a special Luftwaffe paratrooper unit under command of General Karl Student to capture the fortress using an unproven experimental weapon, the combat glider. A glider attack offered a distinct advantage over a paratrooper prop. The Germans found that when paratroopers were dropped on a target, they might be scattered over a wide area. They lose precious time in coming together in an effective fighting force. But a glider can deliver warriors to the same place at the same time. The German DFS-230 carried 1 pilot and 9 fully equipped airborne soldiers. On May 10, 1940, 10 gliders packed with 78 paratroopers were towed into the sky from a German airfield. Miles from the target, long before they were within earshot of the Belgians, the tow planes released their gliders. The German invaders burst from their gliders before the stunned defenders could figure out what was happening. 20 minutes later, 780 Belgian soldiers surrendered at a cost to Hitler of 6 Germans killed and 20 wounded. The world's first glider assault had been a dramatic success. General Student and his battle-proven paratroopers were hailed as heroes. But the fact that they used gliders remained a closely held secret.
Only those intimately involved in the operation knew how the fortress was captured. Allied speculation ran rampant. They thought it perhaps was sabotage, possibly poison gas. But they had no idea at the time that the Germans had an operational glider-borne force.
Just a few months later, however, spies reported to Allied intelligence the surprising details of the German attack. But at the time, America was not at war. The U.S. Army didn't even have paratroopers, much less combat gliders. And building its own glider force was far down on the list of priorities for American strategists. It wasn't until February of 1941, a year after the German attack, that General Henry Hap Arnold, Chief of Staff of the Army Air Force, asked the Army to look into the idea of creating a glider attack force. At the time, the only place to see a glider flying into the United States was at a civilian soaring club. So General Arnold visited a soaring exhibition for a crash course in glider techniques.
The Army Air Chief at the National Glider Meet. Major General Arnold considers unpowered planes essential to modern air war.
Since no one in the military had any gliding experience, Arnold asked the civilian instructors to design a course to teach Army pilots how to soar. Arnold then turned to airplane builders for designs for a new combat glider. As engineers and soaring enthusiasts outlined plans for a U.S. glider program, the Germans gave airborne assault its first full-scale test. On May 20th, 1941, 500 transport planes and 74 gliders carried a German airborne force of 13,000 men across the Mediterranean Sea to attack the British Army on the Greek island of Crete. It was a stunning demonstration of the power of an airborne attack. But the German losses were brutal. Of the 13,000 paratroopers that jumped or glided into Crete, 5,000 were either killed or wounded. The Germans had made a tragic mistake. They had launched the attack in daylight. As a result, the Germans lost the element of surprise.
The gliders were slaughtered on their way down. It was a total disaster. Consequently, although the Germans did prevail in the invasion, Hitler made a determination then and there that other than for a few other minor operations during World War II, the gliders were too dangerous for German soldiers.
The British and the Americans knew nothing of the magnitude of the German casualties. They saw only the end result, that the Germans had won a battle fought entirely by lightly armed airborne forces. Ironically, As the battle in Crete signaled the end of the German glider program, the United States saw it as a call to arms and accelerated its program to send men into combat in gliders. The U.S. Army Air Force gave top priority to the production of powered aircraft, like fighters and bombers, and to the training of power pilots. As a result, when America entered the war in December 1941, the Army's glider program lacked the most essential elements: pilots and gliders. Desperate for volunteers, the Army launched a big recruiting campaign and even relaxed its recruiting standards to attract more men into glider pilot training. By October 1942, there were 10,000 students learning to fly in training gliders. The next priority was to give them a combat glider. In the spring of 1942, the Waco Aircraft Company of Troy, Ohio, had answered the Army's call for a glider and submitted a design for an engineless transport aircraft. It was made out of common materials: wood, metal tubing, and fabric. The glider had no armor, no machine guns for self-defense, and only a thin outer skin made of canvas. The Army eagerly approved the prototype and dubbed it the CG-4A, C for cargo and G for glider. Waco, however, was a small company and couldn't on its own fulfill the Army's demand for gliders. So the Army paid 15 additional companies, furniture makers, piano builders, kitchen appliance manufacturers, and even a builder of coffins, to make more CG-4As.
When I saw it for the first time, I couldn't believe my eyes, and especially when I was shown the interior of it. It looked like the interior of a bass drum. It was nothing but canvas stretched over metal tubing and a plywood floor. It was like being in a box kite.
I thought it was quite flimsy. As a matter of fact, you could poke a stick through the skin of the fabric, made you apprehensive about how well the thing would perform.
Typically, the CG-4A was towed into the air by a C-47 transport plane.
The most important thing was to stay out of the prop wash as you were being towed. And if you got above the prop wash, you could enjoy a pretty smooth flight.
As the tow plane and glider neared the landing zone, the glider pilot released the nylon tow line, and he was on his own. Once free of the tow plane, the glider flight lasted just 15 to 20 seconds.
As soon as we hit the ground, well, all dirt, rocks, and everything else banged against the bottom of this thing. It was a tremendous sound. It scared the living hell out of you. You thought the thing was going to break apart.
The CG-4A was designed to be flown by a pilot and a co-pilot. You could carry a jeep or an artillery piece with 13 fully equipped infantrymen. Unlike the pilots, the men who rode in the back had not volunteered to be part of a glider program. As soldiers, they followed orders, and whether they liked it or not, when they were transferred into the newly created glider infantry regiments, they would go to war in gliders.
I don't know what else I could do. Got to follow orders. So we went up that. And to tell you the truth, I didn't have too much faith in it. I didn't have much faith in planes to begin with at that time. The glider always got off the ground first, as the plane is taxiing down the runway. And as we're flying, we're always above the plane that's towing us.
If the C-47, for any reason, lifts itself and you get caught in that prop wash, then it's more like a kite than it is a glider. It bounces around like a rubber ball.
If you're sitting there with a rifle between your legs, not paying attention, and you drop through that prop wash, the gun would go right up through the the roof, punch a hole in the airplane canvas, then you had another ventilation spot.
And you're hoping that you don't have to throw up. Of course, they says, don't dirty up the glider, do it in your helmet. But then you figure, hey, if I do it in my helmet, then I got to put it back on my head. It'll be all over me.
The new glider infantry regiments were part of airborne divisions like the 82nd and the 101st. The paratroopers in these divisions, who jumped out of the C-47s, received hazardous duty pay. Pilots of the C-47s received additional flight pay. Even the glider pilots got flight pay. But the glider infantry received neither flight pay nor hazardous duty pay. The glider infantry didn't even get parachutes. But since they were flying at such low altitudes, it's doubtful that wearing a parachute would have made any difference.
We were doing a double tow experiment, towing 2 gliders at once. And when they unhooked, one of the gliders swerved under their partner in the other glider, and their tail hit. And they ended up going to nosedive right down to the runway, killed all of them.
In most cases, accidents were an unfortunate byproduct of learning by doing. But in others, the manufacturers, under pressure to build a lot of gliders in a hurry, made the work of glidermen seem like a suicide mission.
And I remember one day there were about 4 of us standing at this glider that we'd already flown a couple of trips around the pad, and the pilot of that glider leaned on that strut that held the wing to the wheel, to the fuselage, and that strut fell off.
There was a lack of quality control and uniformity in the construction of these gliders, with so many contractors building, with parts from so many different places. The United States glider construction program was plagued with problems.
Crashes killed 138 pilots, and in the case of scores of other trainees, like Lynn Gumley, injuries from crashes cost them the chance to go overseas.
Even though so many of those negative things were going on, I don't know anybody who wanted to transfer out of that program. The thrill of flying and the thrill of being unique. I mean, there was something about it that just made you different from everybody else.
The sterling silver wings awarded to glider pilots at graduation further set them apart from their contemporaries who flew powered aircraft.
They had a big G right in the middle. And I can remember so many times people would ask us, what's the G for? And after a while, it got to be a slogan, G for guts, pal.
When the glider infantrymen and the glider pilots shipped out for overseas duty, they were eager to join the war against Hitler's Third Reich and to earn that G for guts, only to see their first mission end in utter disaster. By the spring of 1943, Allied ground troops had just about pushed the German army out of North Africa. With the enemy on the run, British and American war planners prepared their next operation. Husky was the code name for the combined amphibious and airborne invasion of the Mediterranean island of Sicily. The operation would be the first full-scale Allied airborne attack of the war, and the first time the American CG-4A glider would be committed to battle. On July 9, 1943, 144 gliders, American CG-4As, along with the British gliders called Horsas, took off from dusty airfields in North Africa. By the time the airborne force had crossed the Mediterranean and reached the Sicilian coast, it was getting dark. The glider pilots had not rehearsed a night landing for Operation Husky.
Gliders were coming down every place, and it was my experience to come down in the sea about 150 yards short of the land, and we all swam for shore, and we had had no combat training whatsoever. We didn't have the slightest idea what we were doing when we started out.
Chaos reigned. In the darkness, many gliders had been released too far from land while they were still over water.
Almost a third of the gliders crashed into the ocean. Most of the others crashed when they reached the mainland, and only about a dozen made it to their landing zone. It was a tremendous loss of life and a significant failure for the glider program.
In another tragic mistake, the U.S. Navy gunners mistook the approaching airplanes for German aircraft and shot down nearly 24 gliders and transport planes. The next morning, American and British ground troops came ashore and hooked up with the surviving airborne forces. After 38 days of brutal combat, the Allied army succeeded in destroying the enemy and liberating Sicily. But with nearly 20,000 men killed or wounded, many asked if the victory was worth the price. General Dwight Eisenhower, commander of the invasion, thought that the airborne attack had been so botched that he suggested disbanding the airborne divisions. Hot on the heels of the disaster in Sicily, the glider program was dealt yet another blow. On August 1st, 1943, the Robertson Aircraft Corporation, one of the many companies building the CG-4A, wanted to celebrate the completion of its 65th glider with an air show in St. Louis, Missouri.
They had the mayor and the city manager and a bunch of dignitaries that went up in that glider to prove it was safe. And they came over the field about 3,000 feet, and they had a structural failure, and the wing came off. And of course, these guys were all wearing parachutes, but they didn't know how to jump out of an airplane. So they all went in, and everybody on the glider, including the pilot and the co-pilot, were killed.
The FBI investigated the possibility that the glider had been sabotaged by enemy agents, but it turned out that a subcontractor working for Robertson Aircraft had incorrectly manufactured a key part.
It was determined that the defective part was made by a company that prior to making glider parts, made coffins. Thus, gliders earned the name Flying Coffins.
It looked as if the glider program was destined for an abrupt and shameful end. But just 2 days after the crash in St. Louis, undaunted proponents of the glider program invited top War Department officials, including General Hap Arnold, the Air Force Chief of Staff, to a carefully choreographed glider assault. The event was organized by Major Mike Murphy, a former stunt pilot and arguably the best glider pilot in the service. The flawless performance of gliders, glider pilots, and infantrymen convinced the visiting VIPs of the power of a glider force. The stunt had worked. Major Murphy's demonstration breathed new life into the program. Meanwhile, across the Pacific Ocean, in Burma, a small band of 3,000 British, Burmese, and Gurkha guerrillas called Chindits had been fighting a difficult war against the Japanese. Their commander, British General Ord Wingate, appealed to the Americans for assistance. General Arnold, having just returned from the sensational glider demonstration, offered Wingate a small air force of bombers, fighters, transport planes, and 100 CG-4A gliders. Colonel Phil Cochran, a courageous and colorful pilot, was given command of the Special Flying Unit, officially codenamed Project 9, but better known as the 1st Air Commandos. Their mission was to get Wingate's band of irregulars further into Japanese-occupied Burma, resupply them, and evacuate the wounded. On March 5th, 1944, the 1st Air Commandos launched Operation Thursday and landed gliders loaded with Wingate's troops on airfields hacked from the Burmese jungle. Fields they called Broadway, Piccadilly, and Cho Ring Hee. On these bases, the guerrillas struck hard at Japanese targets. It was the first all-glider airborne invasion of the war. For nearly 6 months, Cochrane and his men continued to land gliders to resupply and reinforce Wingate's raiders. To pull out wounded men, the 1st Air Commandos sometimes used a risky but effective technique. As the gliders unloaded supplies, the C-47s continued to circle overhead. Wounded men were placed on board the gliders. The transport planes circled back and retrieved the aircraft using the glider snatch. Wingate's Chindits and Cochrane's pilots had stopped the Japanese and accomplished their mission. The work of the glidermen in Burma became a model of how to wage guerrilla warfare deep behind enemy lines. Impressed, General Dwight Eisenhower called Colonel Cochrane's top glidermen to England to help him plan the biggest operation in the history of warfare. An operation that would begin with a glider attack. Across England in the spring of 1944, soldiers worked around the clock to unpack and assemble more than 1,000 of their CG-4A combat gliders. The glider troops, along with 1.5 million other Allied soldiers, sailors, and airmen, were getting ready for their greatest challenge, the invasion of France. Codenamed Operation Overlord, the attack called for a combined British, Canadian, and American force to storm the beaches along the French coastline in Normandy. The night before the amphibious assault, 3 airborne divisions, 2 American and 1 British, would jump and glide a few miles inland of the beaches to seize key positions and disrupt the German defenses.
One of the things that the airborne didn't discuss with their men was that in the event the seaborne invasion failed and the Allies were pulled back off the beaches, the glidermen and paratroopers were to be left. There was no extraction plan. They would have been slaughtered by the superior German forces in Normandy.
For the glidermen, failure was not an option. To ensure that friendly forces would not shoot at the aircraft in a repeat of the disaster in Sicily, the fuselage and wings of all the aircraft were painted with the distinctive black and white stripes. The paint was barely dry when the troopers began to climb aboard their transports and gliders. Just before midnight, on June the 5th, 6 British Horsa gliders, loaded with a brigade of 150 English paratroopers, took off for Normandy. Their mission was to capture 2 important bridges, an objective that would keep the Germans from sending reinforcements to the beaches. The gliders approached silently, right on target. They touched down within 100 yards of the bridges. And in 15 wild minutes, the British glidermen had overwhelmed the unsuspecting Germans. The first battle of D-Day, a glider-borne assault, was a success. At 1 o'clock in the morning of June the 6th, not long after the British horses had departed for France, the 1st gliders and transports of the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions left their bases in England. By 4 a.m., they were in formation heading over the coast of France. Unable to make evasive maneuvers, the glider pilots and their passengers simply had to endure a storm of anti-aircraft fire.
The flak started to come up and the wings rocked and shuddered from the concussions, and as we headed in, the fire became more intense. We could hear the bullets, the small arms fire, ricocheting off the metal tubing of the glider.
There was flak and anti-aircraft and puffs of smoke all around there and tracer bullets. was kind of scary. It looked like everyone that was coming up there was coming at you.
The altitude that we had to go in and set a pattern from, they could take whatever weapon they had, a 45 automatic, and you could just about hit a glider. And so we were getting fire from all sections, and that's when you separate the men from the boys.
As the planes neared the landing zones, the gliders cut loose from the tow planes and drifted silently into the darkness.
You're truly looking for a space that's open because there are other gliders coming down into the same area that you're in, and you're trying to avoid each other and make it to the ground. And in the meantime, these bullets are coming up through the floor.
The glider pilots strained to find a clearing in the small French field. Hitting one of the thick knots of roots, shrubs, and dirt called hedgerows that bordered the fields could mean disaster. But finding a flat field wasn't the only challenge. The Germans had planted the fields with hundreds of tall wooden poles. These poles, nicknamed Rommel's asparagus, could shear the wings off a glider and impale the aircraft as it landed.
Many of these were wired together and mined so that if a glider did hit one, not only would it be torn apart, but it would be blown up. The American glidermen had no idea that this was waiting for them.
We got on the ground, applied full brakes, put the glider up on the skids, and about 60 miles an hour. We plowed right into the embankment where the hedgerows were. And we were completely covered with dirt, sand, and dust. In the meantime, they're still firing at us. And how we got out of the glider, to this day, I don't recall just how we got out of that glider.
Hedgerows also made perfect hiding places for German snipers. The gliders were caught in a vicious crossfire.
One glider landed and was taking sniper fire. The glidermen fired blindly against one wall of the glider, unloading all of their rifles and even a BAR. When they were done, all that was left was a few shreds of canvas hanging on the metal frame, but the sniper fire stopped.
General Donald Pratt, the assistant division commander of the 101st, came in with the first wave of glidermen. Pratt's pilot was Lieutenant Colonel Mike Murphy, the famous stunt flyer who had organized the air show for General Arnold back in August of 1943. Unbeknownst to Murphy, however, mechanics had bolted armor plating beneath the general's seat for added protection. The extra weight unbalanced the glider and made it difficult to stop. The glider skidded into a hedgerow and the general was killed. Pratt was the highest-ranking American to die in the invasion. Murphy, with both legs broken, managed to pull himself to safety. In the darkness, many paratroopers had dropped in the wrong place. Many gliders had missed their landing zones. The airborne force was scattered all across the French countryside. Small bands of paratroopers and glidermen came together and fought to survive the night. The glider pilots, their flying job over, were now infantrymen. They found themselves fighting alongside the men they had just delivered to the battlefield. At 6:30 in the morning, the amphibious landings had begun. The soldiers hitting the beaches met the full fury of Hitler's war machine. The fate of the glidermen fighting inland hinged on the success or failure of the men struggling ashore. Throughout the day, American and British gliders continued to land, bringing needed reinforcements. By midday, some order began to emerge from the scattered parachute drops and glider landings. As the troops coming ashore busted through the beach defenses, they hooked up with the paratroopers and the glider infantrymen. With the situation stabilized, the glider pilots left the infantry units and began to make their way down to the beaches. They had orders to hop aboard any vessel that was headed back to England in case they were needed to fly again. The glider infantrymen, however, stayed in combat for another 33 days before they were relieved by fresh units. Of the 5,000 Americans delivered into Normandy on gliders, 2,000 of them were the glider pilots. 33 had been captured by the Germans, 120 had been wounded, and 25 pilots were killed. A few weeks after the invasion, a special recovery team was sent to Normandy to find and bring back any airworthy gliders. Of the 500 gliders that landed in France, the team found only 13 gliders worth retrieving. After D-Day, the War Department realized that going to war in a glider was a little more dangerous than going to war in a truck. The glider infantrymen were finally awarded the same hazardous duty pay given to paratroopers. On August 15, 1944, just 2 months after the airborne assault on Normandy, glidermen were back in their CG-4As, leading an Allied force in the invasion of southern France. A month later, on September 17th, the pilots were back at their controls for Operation Market Garden, the liberation of Holland. Their next call to arms came in December 1944. In a surprise attack, the Germans had surrounded the American forces in Bastogne, Belgium. The attack is well remembered as the Battle of the Bulge. But what isn't well known is that glider pilots played a critical role in helping the besieged defenders. The day after Christmas, glider pilots voluntarily flew through a hail of enemy ground fire to deliver medical supplies and ammunition. After the Allied armies regained the ground lost during the Battle of the Bulge, they pushed further into Germany. By March of 1945, the American and British armies were ready to cross the Rhine River into Germany in force. On the morning of March 24, 1945, the Allies kicked off Operation Varsity, the aerial invasion of Germany. It would be their final glider assault in the war in Europe. 906 CG-4As and 440 British Horsa gliders and scores of C-47s flew over the Rhine and delivered 22,000 soldiers in 2 hours and 36 minutes. The American glider pilots would perform the same tasks as they had on other missions. If the situation called for them to fight with the infantry, they would. By now, they were experienced pilots and proficient ground troops, but their standing orders were to return to base as soon as possible. Operation Varsity would be different. On this mission, the 17th Airborne Division was short 1 infantry company. The glider pilots of the 435th Troop Carrier Group volunteered to be organized into 4 platoons of infantry. After landing, they received orders to secure an important crossroads and stop a German counterattack.
They said, oh, you guys take this crossroads. There's nothing going to happen up there. This is where they're going to come through if they come through, and we're putting our special 75mm cannon down here to stop them. You guys don't worry. So where do they come through? They come through our position, exactly. And they attacked us in force. You're afraid to stick your head up out of a foxhole. These glider pilots are trigger happy, one thing. We had a lot of ammunition, and we didn't want to have to carry it back to France. We had one of our glider pilots who had a bazooka. He knocked out one of the tanks, and they decided to pull back and retreat. And the next morning, we didn't have a single casualty in our outfit because we were dug in that well. And it was a miracle that it happened that way. But I'm sure they lost close to 50 or 60 people out of 200 or better.
The overnight clash, remembered as the Battle of Burp Gun Corner, was the only time in Air Force history that a unit made up entirely of Air Force officers engaged the enemy as an infantry platoon. The next day, the glider pilots were marching back to the Rhine, back to their base camps, leading their prisoners to POW pens. It was on the ground and not in the air that some of the pilots experienced firsthand what they had been fighting for.
On the way, we met a lot of civilians, and they all thanked us, you know, American troops, and they were very happy. I came across one elderly gentleman with a little girl, and he was telling me some Dutch people kept him in a cellar with his little daughter for 4 years. And this was the first day of full daylight that he had. And he thanked me, and he cried and I cried. I still can remember it.
Despite notable setbacks, glider pilots and glider infantrymen always came through. Unfavorable weather, confused communications, mid-air accidents, releases in the wrong place, and enemy defenses took their toll on the aircraft, their crews, and their passengers. By definition, being a soldier is always a dangerous profession. But the act of entering combat in unarmed, canvas-covered, engineless aircraft required something extra.
You knew that when you go to war, there's going to be people get killed, and but you go anyway, and you keep it going.
We did what we had to do, and that was that. I was no hero. The real heroes are the guys that are under those crosses, those white crosses in those cemeteries. And there are thousands and thousands of these crosses out there. They're the real heroes.
I get flashbacks of things that happened and very dear, wonderful friends. I ought to explain to you about that, friends. I had high school friends, college friends, fraternity brothers, but I never put them close to the category that I do of those glider pilots that was with me. And I never can forget their lives and what they gave to this country. Courage that you would never believe.
As time goes by, we all tend to forget the tough and the rough part of things that we've done in our lives. We tend to talk about the fun and about all the great buddies you were with and all the excitement, but you forget about the disasters that you were involved with and how many guys were killed and how many guys were wounded and maimed. The gliders did some successful missions, and so in that sense, they accomplished what they were going to do. But in another sense, there was a waste of good young boys who would be alive today if they flew something else or they were in some other branch of the service.
By the time the war ended in August 1945, American industry had built 13,909 CG-4A gliders. The vast majority flew one time, and that was it. Of the 6,000 pilots trained to fly the gliders, 208 were killed in action. The end of World War II meant the end of combat gliders. The Army conducted its last glider training maneuver in 1949. The glider infantry units were disbanded. Helicopters began to do the job once done by those flimsy, canvas-covered, engineless aircraft. Aircraft flown by a small group of brave men who wore silver wings. The wings of a glider pilot. The wings with the G for guts.